Thanks, everybody. I'm coming through your little mics there, or your speakers. All set? All right, good. I'm going to give the first 20 minutes. I've tuned my compression algorithm appropriately, and then I'm going to turn it over to Mickey Tripathi to give you an update on Argonaut. So as Reen introduced, I am the Executive Director of the Office of Technology at the Office of the National Coordinator for Health Information Technology at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Elephant in the room, I know I'm overdressed. But I only have two types of clothes. This is one of them. The other is, what I play baseball in on the weekend. All right, so I'm going to take you through a quick transition to where we are today. I wanted to make sure that you have all the full context for every reference that you hear to the ONC proposed rule. That's a lot of what my team works on and my colleagues in the Office of Policy with whom I do my day-to-day interactions. In 2016, right at the end of the Obama administration, there was something called the 21st Century Cures Act. And these are all the names that the Congress chose to title the sections, but there are two that are the most important that really serve as the title slide that I presented earlier, the dynamic duo between what are called conditions of certification, so a fundamental redesign to ONC's Health IT certification program since the HITECH Act, that was in 2009, and then what's also referred to as quote-unquote information blocking. And so there are provisions in the statute at section 4004 around what's called information blocking. And I'm going to give you a quick orientation of both of those. As a public service announcement, I'm doing a deeper dive 40-minute presentation, so twice the fun, tomorrow on all of the details that I'll cover here. So don't worry if there are a few concepts that you have more information or questions about as I go forward. So first, I wanted to go through how we got here. How did we get here? And timing is a bit of everything. So anyone know what happened in 2007? Seminal technology moment. All right, there we go. Right before the buzzer. All right, the iPhone was released. It's going to be important as we look forward in the next timeline here from side to side. What happened in 2006? Last telegram. Technology has a long tail, okay? And I've included my citation there if you don't believe me. So fast forwarding here through 2008, Google Health, 2009, the HITECH Act, so $35–40 billion of federal investment in EHR adoption, right? So that's one of that first big investments in terms of the platforms on which data is now available. 2010, we have the DEA's e-prescribing controlled substances interim final rule, the kickoff of the DIRECT project, if you're familiar with that, the Affordable Care Act, I put that in as a kind of seminal health policy messaging, and then Meaningful Use Stage 1 and what we refer to as our 2011 edition of certification criteria. 2012, Google Health ends. Meaningful Use Stage 2 and the 2014 edition rules were released. That was as a precursor to Stage 2 actually starting in what was supposed to be 2014. They got moved to 2015, and then we jumped to 2014. So some more recent history that you are now familiar with. FHIR-1 was released. The Argonaut project kicked off. For those of you that have a slight OCD like myself, Argonaut was toward the end of 2014. Don't get hung up on the placements of the points there. All right, 2015 in DC land, the Medicare, trying to remember the acronym, I always just call it MACRA. So MACRA and AMIPS program, Meaningful Use Stage 3, 2015 edition was released. In the 2015 edition, we included the first functional requirement for an application programming interface as part of certified EHR technology. So any of the health IT developers that have products that are used today to participate in CMS programs have deployed APIs that have been certified to the 2015 edition certification criteria. Now, we left the standards choice up to developers, but as I will cover in a little bit, a lot of developers chose FHIR as the trajectory for their development efforts. 2016, 21st Century Cures Act, so we're getting close to the present tense. 2018, FHIR-4 was released, and then Apple Health Records app as part of the iPhone iOS release. Look at the difference, 11 years. Amazing, all right? Think about how far we've come. 2019, Microsoft Health all ends, at least for that business line, and ONC's released its proposed rule. We are on the cusp in 6 months of starting a new decade. And I know we often don't sit back and reflect, on what 2020 is supposed to mean to us. I never expected to be doing what I'm doing starting in 2020. I think a lot of you, I'm sure, having worked in this industry for at least a decade, probably longer, had aspirations for what you thought 2020 would look like. In some respects, we've made a lot of progress. EHR adoption in the United States is quite high. Hospitals is above 90%. Ambulatory providers, 75, 80%, if not higher than at this point as well. So it's important to keep in mind how we got to where we are as we look forward into the future, as we look to the next decade, the 2020s, and really building on even the earlier presentations. You heard about Smart on FHIR earlier, some of the other work going on in the payer community. That's going to be the next decade worth of work. All right, one last caveat. Shows no sign of ending. But you all are the people that can change this. And I'm glad you've attended my keynote. I can implore you, every little chip at the proverbial work in the industry that we're doing will reduce one fax at a time. And maybe that's the goal that we need to take, one fax at a time, taking it off the internet. I say a lot of that in jest, but it's often important, as you saw the Telegram reference earlier. There's a long tail. There's a lot of entrenched workflow that's built around faxing. And a lot of the work that you do, via the EHR launch, for those of you that attended Josh's presentation earlier, or even the standalone launch as part of the Smart app framework, those are a lot of the workflow changes that we need to look into leveraging FHIR to make a big difference. All right, so the dynamic duo here. The left side, conditions of certification. By statute, Congress included a provision in a law that referenced application programming interfaces. So just keep that in mind when you think about, what are all your elected representatives doing in DC. They get down to this level of detail in some cases. The statute is actually quite specific. One of the phrases that I highlight here in parentheses is that the APIs that need to be deployed in pursuant to the Cures Act need to be done so without special effort. And I'll cover a little bit in terms of how we chose to approach that in the proposed rule. There are a number of other conditions of certification, and the takeaway here for you, these apply to health IT developers. So if you're familiar with our certification program through ONC, previously it applied to just the software product. It would go through, it would meet the certification criteria, make sure that the standards and other relevant code systems were included in the products, and then the product would go out into the market. What's changed from this law is that now ONC has the authority to look at the health IT developers' business practices. So my usual example is with Microsoft. Previously we were certifying Microsoft Excel or Word. Now we're overseeing Microsoft's business practices as a whole relative to its software conformance and other business practices. And so a number of these conditions of certification apply to particular business practices that a health IT developer may be engaged in. To the right is the set of exceptions that we created related to the information blocking section of the law. The way that the law works is that Congress said there's an overriding presumption that what's called electronic health information will be exchanged all the time. That's the presumption. When it needs to be accessed, exchanged, and used, electronic health information will be accessible to those that are looking to engage in one of those activities. And then Congress recognized that there are certain limitations that could prevent that information from being exchanged, and then tossed it over to the executive branch to work out all those details. And so the provision that we have in the law is to come up with exceptions for when it may be reasonable or necessary to withhold sharing information. And that's what these exceptions cover. State law would be a good example. If you're in a state in the United States and it prohibits you from sharing certain information, that would fit within one of these exceptions, actually as a general matter. And you wouldn't have the finger pointed at you in terms of being an information blocker if you followed your state law. So that's kind of a concept of how that fits in. But again, it starts from the presumption that all information will be exchanged, and then you start to come into the exceptions that would apply. All right, so I'm going to give you a little bit of a big picture in terms of layers for how all these things fit together. At the biggest picture, information blocking. The other important change here, ONC's authority previously had really focused on health IT developers that went through our certification program. The way that information blocking works is that it applies to 4 different actors: health IT developers that certify products, health information exchanges, which is a functionally described term in our proposed rule, health information networks, again, another functionally described definition in our proposed rule, and then healthcare providers. So there's very little left in the American healthcare system that isn't covered by the information blocking related scope. The way that it works for the first 3 actors, they are subject to enforcement by HHS's Office of the Inspector General. So they're the ones with the badges. They do investigation, most probably well known for Medicare fraud and other things like that. They have authority now to investigate information blocking related complaints and issue up to $1 million per violation fines to those first 3 actors. Healthcare providers would be subject to a different penalty paradigm that is still yet to be determined and worked out through other authority that the Secretary has. So the important point here is the exceptions that I noted earlier, if any of those actors were to leverage one of those exceptions, then they would not be seen as an information blocker. Otherwise, they may be subject to the information blocking penalties. And there are a number of things that fall into the information blocking paradigm from both technical and business practice perspectives. When it comes to the conditions of certification, and I highlight the API condition of certification here, it fits within that larger scope of information blocking, but is specific to health IT developers. And so that's kind of the target actor in the information blocking language. There are a few areas where we've added specificity to this particular condition of certification. When we thought about what constituted special effort, one issue was around access to documentation. So there are different preconditions around or conditions around transparency. There's a second set around fees and the ways in which fees could be applied in an API ecosystem. And then the third was around anti-competitive practices from a business perspective. And so we include conditions around pro-competitive practices to support the ultimately deployed API that would go through our certification process. We also include maintenance of certification requirements. So if you have trouble finding endpoints today, one of the proposals that we included in our rule was that health IT developers certified through our program needed to make available all of the endpoints for their customers in a publicly available way. The last part within the scope of the condition of certification is the technical aspect. And so that includes the proposals, I have to keep reminding everyone at this point, that we included relative to the technical capabilities that health IT software would need to include. A lot of similar terminology that you may be familiar with, FHIR, App Launch Framework, OAuth 2, etc. The way that this looks in a slightly different way in terms of the actors, and I'll translate the names here for you, the bottom left corner are API technology suppliers as we refer to them in our rule. Those are the health IT developers that get products certified, effectively the FHIR server developers. And so there are certain certification requirements that would apply to them. Information blocking would apply to them. The condition of certification overall would apply to them, and then the specific technical capabilities as well. The API data providers at the top would be the healthcare organizations that receive or deploy the API technology that's been certified by those API technology suppliers. You can tell I've practiced all this so I don't trip over all my APIs. And the relationship here to, if you remember the different covered actors, you have API data providers, again, translation healthcare organizations. They're covered by the information blocking statute, which is why that information blocking leg of the triangle applies between API users, which could be patients, and the healthcare organizations as a whole. Down the bottom, there are other relationships between app developers, patients, et cetera, that would apply, again, from an information blocking perspective. So this is just one visual to describe how the layers fit together, how our proposals align with one another. We also included the US Core Data for Interoperability. This is an evolution of what was previously referred to as the Common Clinical Data Set in the prior editions of our proposed rules and our regulatory process. This is all the data that we proposed to be made available via FHIR-based APIs. And so we're going through the public comment disposition process now. Our comment period ended last Monday. We received over 2,000 public comments, which was 4 times higher than any of the prior rulemakings that we've ever engaged in. A lot of interest, a lot of work for us now. For everyone that raised their hand earlier, I think when Ryan asked about if you've read the rule, at least on the ONC side, we probably got 5 to 20 times the amount of page length back to us as we gave to you all to review for the first time. This is a starter set. We have a process that we're going to engage in to update the US CDI over time to issue more and more versions. So it's something to keep in mind as we look at, and as you look at participating in the HL7 process, as you look at participating in other types of events like this to make more data available. This is the starting point from which we've proposed to have FHIR-based APIs made available. The one last thing that I'll note in terms of deployment, FHIR implementation nationwide. As I mentioned with the 2015 edition, one of the things that we required, even though we gave health IT developers the flexibility to choose the standard that they wanted to deploy for their API, we made them publish their API documentation. And then I had a few folks on my staff brute force their way through all that documentation that was listed on our Certified Health IT product list, and then come up with some rough statistics about how FHIR was being deployed. If you recall back to the EHR incentive programs, they apply both to hospitals and then to different types of what are called eligible clinicians now. On the hospital side, just to make the math easy, there are roughly about 5,000 hospitals in the United States. Based on the market share or kind of attestation share of health IT developers that serve those hospitals, the top 10 really represent a large number of those hospitals. And so when you look at the top 10 health IT developers that have gotten certified to the 2015 edition APIs using FHIR, that gets you the number that you see there. About over 80% of hospitals today in the United States are more than likely to have the DSTU2 FHIR Argonaut implementation guide deployed in their, their systems, their production systems today. And so 2019 is a compliance year for hospitals participating in CMS's programs using the 2015 edition software. They have up until the end of this year, the last 90 days, to get everything in place, but a vast number of them already have from the leading health IT developers. On the ambulatory clinician side, a little bit more diverse, but you still see that same pattern. Top 10, top 20 health IT developers in the ambulatory side roughly equate to about 70% of MIPS eligible clinicians, and that's on the ambulatory side again. All right, the one other thing I can mention here, in terms of the shading and the coloring in of the map, blue is less than 50%, anything else above that is 51% or higher. The red, dark red places are, these aren't counties, so what these are referred to, for those of you that do some of the economic analyses, they're called hospital referral regions. So it's a different way to shape the medical trading areas of the United States, and so that's what these gerrymandered lines are. In the hospital referral regions, anything that's dark red there, 100% saturation, most likely by Epic or Cerner customers in those locations, some Meditech as well. But that'll give you a rough sense of the geographic areas in the US that are 100% saturated from a healthcare and hospital ecosystem. Since we're here at DevDays, I wanted to also make you aware of a tool that ONC has invested in that we call Inferno. I can't go anywhere without playing on words here for FHIR. It is a server testing tool. You can find it available at the URL. It's now deployed to support R2 as well as R4 in a preliminary way, more specifically focused on the Argonaut implementation guide, the app launch framework stuff from a security perspective. We also have, when you go to that page, you can go into two different doors. One is around certification program compliance. We call that the program edition. So if you're interested in eventually getting tested and certified through the certification program, we have that door, which will focus on specific scope and compliance obligations. And then we're also making a big investment in making a community edition available. So for those of you that want to collaborate in an open source way, all this available on GitHub. You can download it to locally install it. You can also run it through the web-based applications that we have available as well. So wanted to make sure that this resource was available and known to you. We're going to keep updating it over time. So if you have any feedback or you work through it while you're here and you want to see me and tell me in person, happy to have your feedback. Otherwise, there's a team of folks that are actively working on making Inferno better. And again, this is a community-wide tool. So to the degree that we can include functionality that you think would be valuable, please let us know, because we are making that investment with your taxpayer dollars. With that being said, I'm going to call my colleague, Mickey Tripathi, over here, and he can introduce himself, unless you're going to introduce him. I'm going to. All right, Reen's going to introduce him. Thank you very much. Here's my email. It's a pleasure to be with you. My session again tomorrow morning. Tomorrow morning, yeah. And I'll cover the API condition of certification in more detail. And the Inferno
session. We also have an Inferno session here. Yeah, by MITRE. It's, I don't know what when that is, but it's in your schedule. There's a session on Inferno as well. Well, thank you, Steve.
Thanks.